We're delighted to have Greg Woolf talking to us today. In one of the last talks he gives in Britain, or in Europe, perhaps I should say, since I'm speaking from Rome, before he goes to UCLA in Los Angeles. He's a historian and archaeologist specializing in the Roman Empire, a historian and archaeologist of considerable importance, with a very wide range of works. I'd cite his book on the origins of Romanization in Gaul, Becoming Roman, from 20 years ago. His work on Roman ethnography, and his recent extremely large book, The Life and Death of Ancient Cities and Natural History, which came out 18 months ago and which is probably going to have some relationship to what he's going to say today. But anyway, his range runs from straightforward archaeology through to gender and religion in a way that few people can manage. He's taught at St Andrews for a long time. He's been in the Institute of Classical Studies as its director for 6 years, and as I said, he's just about to move to Los Angeles. So we just wish to hear from you, Greg. Over to you. The sustainability of cities in the Roman Mediterranean.
Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you all for coming. It's delightful to be in Rome, even virtually. It's always delightful to be in the school really as well, and let's hope some of us are there in the near future. I hope now the screen share has come on again, is that right? Is my screen now visible?
Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Great. Okay, so but the theme I have today does indeed, as Chris said, connect to my recent very large book. Although it builds on it in other ways as well, because of course, as soon as you finish a book and send it off, you get new ideas, which is either annoying or stimulating. So some bits of it I hope will be different, if not completely contradictory to what's in the tome. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is mostly about disasters and catastrophes, of which we have very many in the ancient world. But I'm particularly interested in ways in which they're survived and the remedies people took both to prevent them and to deal with them. And this absolutely apocalyptic picture of Pompeii and Herculaneum is, of course, a 19th century imagining of disasters, but there are plenty of ancient disasters. And I'll present along the way a few bits of testimony to show that the ancients too are quite interested in this question of disasters and their survivability, their recoverability. The talk's got 4 parts. I'm going to start with talking about some general concepts: sustainability, resilience, risk, but not for very long, I promise. But then I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things about the ancient Mediterranean that make it a particularly risky environment, or perhaps the particular risks of the Mediterranean, because other environments are risky too. Then I'll move on to responses made to it, both by political authorities and citizens and individuals, and come to at the end towards a set of speculations more than arguments about how this regime of risk might have shaped the kind of urbanism that the Mediterranean basin gets in the Roman period. Now, I suppose that the sort of center point of this is a sense that we have depictions both of terrible disasters and of extraordinary prosperity. And so these two, both from Pompeii, and ancient now rather than 19th century. One is this rather nice little illustration on an altar in the house of Caecilius Jucundus, showing Pompeii being shaken by an earthquake. It looks rather like one of those classic Trek episodes where the entire crew on the bridge of the Enterprise had to run alternative to the left and the right to indicate that the ship was being shaken back and forth. And you can see perhaps a few gods sticking their legs out from the things they're riding as the temple lurches in one direction. And then on the right, we have the opposite, a picture of abundance, a picture of Mount Vesuvius, covered in grapes, Bacchus, a Lacrima Christi almost produced there. And these two images of Pompeii, produced not so far apart, indicate both terrible disaster. The earthquake was in 62 rather than the explosion of pyroclastic flows that destroyed the city in 79. And here we have Seneca's account. This is within his within the natural questions, but also addressed to Lucilius, like the moral questions. And I'm not going to read the entire thing, but it begins with the locus amoenus, the beautiful city on an amazing bay, converging shores, and then disaster happening in winter, widespread destruction, Campania, never without risk of such a calamity, because this is, of course, an area of high risk, as we'll see in a moment. And then just a few details, and perhaps the one I particularly want to pick out, because I won't come back to this particular passage, but I'll refer to it later. Differential effects in various areas. So Nuceria, not far away, has a shock, but not damage. Naples touched by it. Also the difference between the private houses and the public buildings. Private houses more vulnerable than public ones. Villas on the cliffs, shaken, not too much damage, and then statues split open, sheep destroyed, people driven crazy, etc., etc. This is the cover picture from the tome, and what I'm talking about is a preoccupation of the book, and I'm summing up here not exactly a paradox, but a particular question about ancient Mediterranean, that the ancient Mediterranean, to summarize my summary, is a pretty bad place to build cities. Cities appear much, much later, despite an abortive efforts at urbanization in the Aegean in the middle of the second millennium BC. Urbanism comes into the Mediterranean world much later than it does in other parts of the Near East. But once it arrives there in the Iron Age, in the early first millennium or last millennium BCE, it survives for a long period. And so although this is apparently an area where the landscapes and the climate and the relief and the pedology, the hydrology, all of it creates huge problems for creating urban civilizations, nevertheless, a version of urbanism, or a series of convergent versions of urbanism, appear and then last on for an enormously long time. It is a staggering fact that most of the cities that were around in 500 BCE are still there 1,000 years later. And if that's not an index of sustainability, I'm not quite sure what is. And of course, some still survive today. Athens has some reasonable claim to be the oldest city in the Mediterranean, as having survived now for what, 3,500 years. Although, of course, in many different forms and taking different functions, different sizes throughout that long period. And so this is my central question. Given the huge obstacles to urbanism in the Mediterranean basin, what is it that makes that collection, that distribution, that network of cities, despite all the transformation it goes through, what does it give them? It gives it some level of sustainability throughout this long period. What is sustainability? You've got an OECD definition at the top, which of course now focuses very much on environment, on the capacity, if you like, to avoid progressive degradation of the resources on which it's based. So something sustainable as we look forward is something which isn't going to undermine its economic and its environmental basis. And then sustainable development in this UN report, which I should have put on as produced in 1987. But as you read through the sustainability lecture, increasingly it's about balance. It's about balance, environmental balance, social balance, economic factors. Sometimes it's not about growth. Sometimes it's about stability. Sometimes development is envisaged in more of a almost a spiritual sense rather than development like economic development, certainly not like economic growth. So sustainability then is lasting power, I suppose. And I want to introduce a second concept, which I think also helps a little bit with this, and that's resilience. Now, the Rockefeller Foundation produced a report. I've given you the link at the bottom for a project called 100 Resilient Cities. And in this case, they're interested in what it is that gives individual cities a capacity to survive shocks, or rather not just survive shocks, but survive chronic stresses. And this distinction, I think, is quite an important one, certainly for this paper. Distinction in chronic stresses, stuff that's there all the time, not the sudden shock of a volcano exploding in your backyard, but high levels of unemployment that last over a long period, basic inefficiencies of public services, cultures of violence, and of course, perhaps the most important for us looking at ancient cities, chronic shortages of things on which you depend. And they specify food and water, but we could add fuel, since fuel is mostly sourced locally by ancient cities. And we could think also about human resources, since many ancient cities depend on being able to draw more humans in to make up for the deficit created by the so-called urban graveyard effect, that in large cities in the pre-industrial world, it is generally believed that the death rate exceeds the birth rate. And so cities are mostly, cities of any size, are mostly consumers of humans as well. So that's the chronic stresses, the background, the sort of the tension against which every urban has to work. And then acute shocks, fire, flood, disease, epidemic, terrorist attacks today, sieges, warfare in the past, and so on. And so resilience against these two, against both chronic stresses and acute shocks, seems to be pretty central towards achieving sustainability. So what stresses did ancient cities suffer? The chronic stresses, disease, malnutrition, interlocking with each other, and then acute stresses, well, there's a picture of one. Now, quite a lot of work's been done on chronic stress, and a very large amount of it is based on the work of Peter Garnsey and his work on food supply and food crises in the ancient world, published in 1988, but still fantastically important. And along with that and later work, he argues a strong sense that the acute crises are not the ones we should really worry about, it's the chronic ones. That there were occasional food crises, but there were no dramatic famines, and certainly not endemic periods of famine in the ancient world. What was endemic was malnutrition, was a shortage of food and a poor quality of food for large numbers of the population of the ancient world. And although this view has been recently subjected to interesting criticism by Kim Bowes, the idea that antiquity is all about poverty and all about and I'm certain she's right that there are variations which we're not covering when we just look at this big picture. I still think that Garnsey and those others who've worked on this have made a powerful case for the ancient world suffering strongly from deficits in food, the ancient Mediterranean world. And he's also interested in the way in which it interacts, that malnutrition leads to less labour per person. It makes them more vulnerable to endemic disease. It limits fertility, both by making it more difficult to conceive and more difficult to carry pregnancies to term. The life chances of children born to malnourished parents or malnourished themselves or both are much less than others. And although the range of endemic diseases is vast and various, it also, of course, makes you vulnerable to epidemics. So among the various chronic stresses that ancient urbanism faces, although also people who don't live in cities, perhaps for some of them worse than this, since cities tended to hoover up surpluses when food was short, it's that level of chronic stress. And then if we want to have an example of acute stress, here we have a long letter, which is worth considering it because it's an interesting set of different reflections on disaster. And this is Seneca reflecting on the recent fire in the colony of Lyon. And so this is again rather like his account of Pompeii in the natural question, the earthquake in Pompeii or the earthquake in Campania. And of course, it also serves a set of other purposes, rather like the recently discovered treatise of Galen on grief, which is not in fact only about how terrible it is to lose your library, but losing your library, among other things, provides opportunity for more general reflections. But here we have a set of discussions of something which is a constant threat to big cities in the ancient world: fire. Even earthquakes, violence, destructiveness through whole cities. No conflagration ever blazed forth so savagely any town, left nothing for a second. So many beautiful buildings, any single one which make a single town famous, wrecked in one night. A little bit of hyperbole here, thinking about the archaeology of Lyon in the middle of the 1st century CE. It's not so gorgeous, but for his purposes, Lyon, the pride of Gaul, is missing. Now, I want now in the second part to talk a little bit more about what I'm going to call the Mediterranean risk regime. And I'm going to go quite rapidly through a whole series of factors. And this is because I think this is an area we have simplified too much and thought really only about famine and food supply. And I think this is and so we need to think about some of the other things that make the Mediterranean an area which was less amenable to urban experiments during the Bronze Age than were many other areas of the planet. And so I'll quickly skip through tectonics, through the relief and pedology of the Mediterranean, through its temperature, its climate, if you like, hydrology, and then, of course, the other whole bundle of factors, anthropogenic ones. So first of all, as I'm sure most people listening know, the Mediterranean lies across a series of tectonic plate boundaries, one plate moving north, pressurizing the plates to the north of this, and leading to a series of zones in which both volcanicity and earthquakes have characterized the Mediterranean throughout the last 3 millennium anyway, and the millennia anyway, and they're the ones we know about. So there you sit in Rome at the middle of a sort of line of volcanic events, from the Castelli Romani to your south up to the volcanic lakes, Lago di Bracciano, Lago di Bolsena to the north. And so you're absolutely in one of these areas, and the architecture and materials reveal this. And then also, of course, that area around the Central Aegean, a massive tsunami in the 4th century, just AD, just off the western coast of Crete, which created problems as far east as Alexandria. Quite recent earthquakes in and around Corinth, and then devastating earthquakes in Izmir. So a whole series of areas, and up and down the Apennines as well. I remember what a particularly turgid Roman archaeology conference session when a whole bunch of us were sitting snoozing in Ravenna, leaning against the walls of the building, and suddenly we're all shaken awake, and it wasn't a particularly good joke. It was the sound of the roof coming down in Assisi, several hundred miles to the south, which was still reverberating up to Ravenna and that conference spot. So this is a characteristic of the Mediterranean even today, and of course behind some of those disasters that Seneca was telling us about earlier. In terms of the relief of the Mediterranean, partly raised up by tectonism, but also creating a series of imbalances. So west-facing slopes like Portugal and Western Greece, the Ionian Isles, and Tuscany, well-watered, and by contrast, Valentia, the Mezzogiorno, Attica, starved of water since the rain shadow created as predominantly rain coming in off the Atlantic. So the Mediterranean is fragmented in terms of hydrology that way, creating the possibilities of vertical economies, although I think most of us now think that there weren't long distance and large scale transhumance upwards and forwards in the classical period of the Mediterranean, that social structures intervened. Here we have a variety of different forms of relationships between relief and landscapes, and perhaps particularly wanted to pick out how we had the areas of karst landscapes, which and in the hills, but then surrounding them a series of tiny plains in which rich soils allow for pockets of rich agriculture, particularly where there's good water, but highly fragmented. So this is contributing to a general fragmentation in the Mediterranean. Here again, volcanism, sites of key volcanoes in the last 10,000 years. So I told you I was moving quite rapidly. Few, of course, couldn't get away without a shot of Santorini and another peering down at the mouth of Vesuvius from above. And then the earthquakes of recent periods, to make the point that I made earlier, showing the lines of the tectonic plates. So these are all risk factors, but perhaps the main thing to say about them is they're not general. It's not the case that any one of these things happens everywhere. Not all the Mediterranean is arid, not all the Mediterranean is an earthquake zone. And ancients as well as ourselves are well aware of this variability in risk. And they're also, of course, well aware of variability in temperature and in rainfall. And although this is actually from the late 20th century, so already significantly hotter than in earlier periods, you get some sense of the enormous differences in climate here and in rainfall. And the Mediterranean is often said not an area blessed with large numbers of big rivers. The Nile, the Po do their bit to the Rhone, but many areas without much rainfall to supplement, without much river water to supplement rainfall. So a series of arid environments, but significant variation from one area to another. This has been picked out since the work of Paul Halstead and then later Garnsey and most latterly Horden and Purcell. Many areas experience significant differences from one year to another in the amount of rainfall they get, and this translates in certain areas like Attica into unpredictable harvest and a high risk of crop failures in various crops. Although it's also important, since that point is made all the time, to point out there are other areas of the Mediterranean where this really isn't a problem. It's really not a problem in Portugal. It's not really a problem in Tuscany. But by and large, we're seeing a pattern of shortages and surpluses at a local scale. So not usually empire-wide shortages and not empire-wide gluts. The cultural response to this in the first millennium BCE and the first millennium CE is the appearance of the microcity. In this environment, if you have a lot of small areas and enough of them are subject to wild variations in the amount of food available, the worst thing you can do is put very large populations on top of them. And that's the fundamental reason why the Mediterranean, when it gets urbanized, has very few large cities in it. Even the villages of prehistoric Anatolia are bigger than most of the cities of Iron Age and Roman Mediterranean. This is also true of the villages of Chalcolithic Poland. So there's many areas where you have large concentrations of population, but the Mediterranean isn't one of them. When you find places like Athens, which creeps up at its peak into the tens of thousands, or Rome, which makes it maybe to 1 million, maybe not. These are exceptional cases, and they sit out against a background of micro-cities. And I'll come back to this in the last part of the talk. The only cities which safely can grow beyond a few thousand people are ones that can guarantee supply from a distance. Almost none have got the commercial power to do it. And so we're really looking at those that have, briefly, the political power. And then the last factor in this Mediterranean risk regime I wanted to pick out is the human factor. It's anthropogenic causes, or stressors, if you like. Some of them are background noise. They're things that are going on without anybody setting it out, without anybody deliberately doing it. And the fundamental one, I suppose, is demographic growth. And if Fryer and Scheidel and others are right, even growing at this very modest average rate of 0.1% of growth per annum, this increased the general population of the Mediterranean basin from about 50 million to about 60 million from the beginning of the Iron Age into the early Roman Empire. And so by the time of, say, the Emperor Hadrian, if you like, there are 4 times as many people as there were in the Mediterranean that is being settled and urbanized and organized first by Phoenicians and then shortly afterwards by Etruscans and Greeks and various other local groups. So this is a background stressor, more hungry mouths. And of course, it's also producing background input of energy, more people to produce work, since the main source of energy in ancient agriculture and ancient building, for that matter, is human labor. But the background noise, the background music is more and more people need to be fed century by century. And then concomitant with that, increases in land use and extension of arable, a slight intensification in some areas. Livestock still not very intense, not yet the huge herds of sheep that are characteristic of the early modern, late medieval Mediterranean, and some livestock living in a sort of synergistic way with arable. And then also deforestation. This is an area where a lot of recent research is telling us much more. The old idea that as soon as there's Athenian navies, all the forests are cut down, that's clearly wrong. But it is very evident from the work of William Harris and others that by the Roman period, particularly for timber, for the kind of trees you need to build large structures and large vessels, some areas are now being protected in the same way that some metal reserves and some sources of building stone are being protected by political powers. And this strongly suggests that this is an area of stress. So those are the things that are going on in the background. But there are also things that humans or groups of human states, cities and empire does, which cause more dramatic stresses. One of the, and I picked out two in particular, one is moving bits of the population around. And this goes on from at least the 4th century BC and in the Near East from much earlier, from the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And this is creating huge cities by forcing people to go and live in them. Synoikism, as Greeks call it, and Macedonian monarchs pick up where Persian monarchs had begun, or Persian monarchs had carried on from Assyrian monarchs. And then also colonization, which covers a huge range of activities, everything from settling Catoicists in Ptolemaic Egypt, in the Seleucid Empire, even perhaps on a much, much smaller scale, Athenian colonists in the height of the 5th century empire, deporting populations, not a big feature of the Mediterranean compared to the Near East, but it happened in Sicily, tyrants moving people together, and then of course the various Roman colonization efforts in Italy, in the Middle Republic, and in around the Mediterranean basin, the Western Mediterranean in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. And then also warfare. Civil unrest, external conflicts and sieges, and these have a major impact. Now, one of the things perhaps to point out about the impacts is that although they're often highly picked out in histories, probably the attention given to them by our ancient sources the wrong way round. We hear a lot about the fall of cities. And so this is partly because in ancient historical writing, Persepolis blazing after Alexander the Great sets fire to it, the Romans in Syracuse, Scipio weeping as Carthage is finally torn down at the end of the 3rd Punic War, Mummius destroying Corinth and then telling his soldiers this, they destroy the old portraits, they'll have to replace them with new ones, a sign of Roman power and barbarism, recounted by several Greek sources. And then we kind of missed it, but it's pretty clear that Book 5 of Tacitus's Histories is heading for an epic destruction of Jerusalem by Titus, because that's the way the first chapter of the history sets it up, but we don't quite get there. So destroyed cities is a major feature of the historiographical landscape. It's the high point, it's the tragic denouement or punctuation marks. And yet most of these cities, apart from Persepolis, they aren't really destroyed, are they? They're still there. Syracuse is still there. Corinth is still there. Jerusalem's still there. Carthage isn't still there, but Tunis isn't. It's just next door. And not only is it been restored now, but they're restored much soon after their destruction. So these destructions are probably don't affect the long-term sustainability of urbanism, however unpleasant it is to be in them, cities at the time. What's much more dramatic is the failure of deportation projects. Now, this is something which in the modern world, James C. Scott in this wonderful book, Seeing Like a State, has made very clear, writing mostly about 20th century projects from those of Soviet Russia and those of Maoist China, but also enormous projects of reorganizing landscapes in the American South in particular, has demonstrated how often states set about to reorganize ecologies and human populations, and how often it's an utter and terrible disaster. And we can see, I think, some signs of this in ancient projects as well. Here is Strabo commenting on the fate of Megalopolis. Now, Megalopolis is created in the 4th century, along with Messini, as attempts to put the Spartans back in their box forever by bringing together all these scattered little micro-cities of Arcadia, which are quite happily bubbling along in a way that I've suggested already is very environmentally friendly or very ecologically sustainable across the mountains of Arcadia, the rocky kernel at the heart of the Peloponnese. Sparta's enemies bring them together, pen them into this vast city, which is called Vast City, Megalopolis, no points for originality here. And the city fails. Warfare, agriculture, the great circuit walls never filled up, and as Strabo comments, writing, so this is 300 to 400 years later, writing from the perspective of the Mediterranean of Pompeii and Augustus. Cities, now the great city itself is suffered the fate described by the comic poet. The great city is a great desert. And this is not an isolated case. Here's another example on the left, and a testimony from Livy, which is almost hilarious when you read the great accounts of colonization that you'll sometimes find, including in modern literature, Rome spreading out its population, creating this dispersed polis. So here we have in 186, this is sort of tagged onto the year of which the bacchanals are thrown out, and one of the praetors for the next year he'd gone on a journey, a sort of fact-finding tour down to southern Italy to visit some of Rome's recent colonies. And a couple of them were empty. Well, one of them on the Adriatic and then Buxentum. And there's no one there anymore, that the Romans had settled their colonists and then they just decided it wasn't going to work. So we tend to take often at face value colonists, and Evan Jewell has pointed this out rather brilliantly, I think, in his latest essay on colonization. And he's pointed out that we take for granted the idea that colonies are unalloyed goods, benefits to the Roman people at the expense of the conquered people, and a great sort of way of generating Romanitas up and down the peninsula. But at least some people scattered their colonies, just couldn't hack it and went off again. And when you look at colonies like Kosia as well, you find these colonies have to be topped up at regular intervals. So much of Roman colonization is as much a failure as some of these projects of the 20th century that James C. Scott talks about. And here on the right, you have a different kind of failure. This is the kernel of a Roman city that's going to be one of a series of civitas capitals organizing the new Roman province of Greater Germany, or Free Germany, well, not Free Germany, of Germany beyond the Rhine. Already constructed, laid out, monuments established, brought in the equestrian statue, but then the disaster of the Varusschlacht, the loss of 3 legions in AD 9 to Arminius' army, means Romans abandon this and move back. So I'm going to be talking quite a lot about failures along the way, because you can't understand sustainability without spotting its limits. You can't understand, you can't either understand resilience without knowing what doesn't succeed. So failed foundations. My last slide in this section alludes to a rather wonderful paper by Cam Gray about a less famous eruption of Vesuvius, that in the late antiquity in 472. And what Cam does here is this is a beautifully put together paper that brings together in almost a past and present type way disaster studies, ecology, history, archaeology, to examine a disaster that didn't hit the front page in quite the same way, that quite a lot of important chronicles and histories just seem to miss it completely, reminding us how lucky we are to have Seneca with his unerring eye on things that should remind a good Stoic that you shouldn't be too triumphant. And so here we have an account of this, and what Cam shows brilliantly, I think, is the sort of the applicability of this fundamental rule of disaster science, that disasters don't happen simply through an outside attack. It's not just a volcano, just the Antonine Plague, just killer gerbils from the Near East, whatever you think is destroying the Roman Empire in various ages. That you also need to look at the vulnerabilities. You know, how is a society set up that makes it survive or not survive particular kinds of outside inputs? So it's this combination of outside force, catalyzing force, could be an epidemic, could be a volcano, or could be any of these various factors I picked out in what I've called the Mediterranean risk regime. And then how is a society set up either to withstand these things or to be particularly vulnerable to them? And this is the thread I want to follow as I go on. So, sorry, this should be number 3. Responses, and I'm going to start with relief efforts after disasters and then go on to, so you don't get too excited, a much shorter section on disaster prevention. And I'm drawing a little bit on this recent set of essays edited by Tony Nacho de Oyo, which brings together for Greek as well as Roman history a series of quite interesting short essays on disasters viewed through the lens of modern humanitarian disaster science. One of the best attested disasters and relief efforts is that of a horrendous earthquake that strikes the province of Asia early in the reign of Tiberius. It's documented by Tacitus in the Annals. It's also documented by this rather nice statue base from Puteoli, the southernmost port of Rome, but also the port as Dikiarchia, to which Greeks connected. So this is, if you like, this is the Greek door of Rome in the reign of Tiberius. And Greek cities set up a monument thanking the emperor for his help. And it's happening in exactly one of those tectonic hotspots, you know, very like the relatively recent earthquake that tears apart cities up and down the Mediterranean coast of Turkey. And an area of high urbanism, so an area where there are large cities and have been since the Hellenistic, and in some cases it's before that, and destroys monuments. And the emperor responds by offering 5 years of tax remission. This isn't, of course, a grant of money. What he's saying is, for the next 5 years, you don't need to send us the stuff you'd have sent us anyway. Since Julius Caesar, the cities of Asia have collected tax on behalf of the Roman Empire, as well as collecting local tax on behalf of themselves. And so what's happened is they're being allowed to keep that and spend it on urban reconstruction. So this doesn't actually cost Tiberius anything immediate up front. He's simply saying for the next 5 years, we're foregoing a very significant amount of tax from the province of Asia. And as you can see, this is well received. Now, although that's very well attested, it's not unique. Here we have Suetonius' account of the aftermath of the eruption of 79 CE of Vesuvius. And as you see, it's rolled together a series of other disasters, plagues, fires. And here you have Titus doing his bit as the good prince, which he's doing partly in this life to contrast with being a sort of Prince Harry type, sorry, not blessed modern Prince Harry of Californian fame, but I think of Shakespeare's Prince Harry, that Titus had led a wild and dissolute youth, hanging out with beautiful boys and with foreign princesses. So maybe not completely different from our Prince Harry. And then as an emperor, he turned out to exceed expectations, like Shakespeare's Henry V. And of course, his brother Domitian waiting patiently to be the next life in Suetonius' collection is going to show us the disaster. So Titus is being built up here. But notice the way, it's not so much whether he's a good emperor, but the mechanisms he uses. commissioners sent to repair the losses. Reassigning the wealth from those who have died in the eruption to repair of the cities. Again, this is an organizational contribution, but it's not a big transfer of imperial wealth. And then ornaments the palaces, where this is the famous sort of trick that emperors do in the 1st century CE, which is that they claim that they have private property which they spend on the people. Augustus did it as well, and they distinguish this from public property, although it's very clear that the boundaries between the public purse and the private purse are exceptionally osmotic in the early empire. So he applies all the ornaments from his palaces to decorate the temples, public utility, sends down some equestrians to do it, and of course, sacrifice, religious responses, all means both human and divine. And Titus's response to this and Tiberius's response to what happened in Asia in AD 17 itself follows on a set of Republican precedents. And here we have it recorded in the late antique chronicle of Orosius, the Senate acting to relieve the, I'm not sure I've got the date right there actually. Looks wrong. I'll check it. Dealing with the aftermath of eruption of Catania, in the eruption of Etna in the vicinity of Catania, and yet again 10 years remission from taxes. So this is again Tiberius picking up a previous trend. So what kind of releases do emperors offer in the case of disaster? They offer a stay of execution or temporary relief of tax. They don't send out great stocks of money. They certainly don't send out relief workers. They don't deploy the military or anybody else. They don't send reserves of equipment. At best, they ask if you're aristocrats to go down and organize things, what Titus is doing. So this is the kind of help that emperors feel appropriate and the Senate feels appropriate to give for disasters in the provinces. They're also not doing it to anybody. And I want to pick out here on a fairly fundamental point, which is that the help you get depends on who you are. Shouldn't surprise us, really. Entitlement theory is coined by Amartya Sen, who's looking at the Ethiopian famine. The question here is who starves when food gets short? And the answer is the poor and the marginal. And that's again no big surprise. And who suffers in the ancient empire? People who in other ways are less entitled. And although you can do, and Gandhi does a little bit of this, try and spot which bits of the population, find anecdotes of dancers philosophers being driven out of cities when there isn't enough grain, or dancers being kept in cities and others driven out. Galen talking about how the rural populations suffer at the expense of the urban population when food is short. But by far the best study of this recently, and this is from this very productive group in Princeton who are working on resilience in the ancient world. This is a really nice study of 3 cities, Antioch, Apamea and Beirut in the 6th century CE. Now, late antique specialists know that 6th century CE was a particularly rough time to be in Syria. An alternation of earthquakes and Persian invasions and epidemics meant that these cities suffer body blow after body blow. But what Izdebski and his collaborators show is they don't all suffer in the same way. The Antioch, which has privileged access to imperial support, is constantly rebuilt and replenished. And this is true actually earlier in the 4th century, that you can get bishops and orators are able to extract resource from Constantinople to build up Antioch. Apamea has a wealthy aristocracy, a wealthy curial class, which provides certain amount of support. Beirut, really not at all. And so in the differential susceptibilities of these 3 cities to disaster, we see how gradations of entitlement work. And this maybe suggests that it's better to be in Campania when disaster strikes, because Campania is an area which the Roman elite know very well, than to be somewhere else. And the cities of Asia are going to do better than some others. So different limits on imperial help. Imperial assistance is directed in the most prominent cities, to the Alexandrias and Antiochs and Ephesus and Smyrnas of the world, and to favoured places in Italy. That the help was financial rather than in kind. There was never any kind of emergency service. There was not even a use of military service, as far as I can see, to help out. The one exception, perhaps, is the use of the fleet from Misenum by Pliny the Elder to try and evacuate people from the Vesuvian cities. As we know, there were not many people to evacuate from those cities, and a lot of them didn't make it. So this gives us, again, some idea of the limitations. One of the largest naval bases in the Mediterranean still couldn't safely remove the populations of the people on the other side of the bay when disaster hit. And so the result of this is that most cities rely not on imperial but on local help to recover from disasters. It's also been suggested, and this is an idea that begins with prehistorians and is picked up particularly by Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell in The Corrupting Sea, which is amazingly 20 years old, but we're still talking about it. And this is an idea that the Mediterranean is in some way structurally set up to respond to risk. And that it's structurally set up because, although highly fragmented, these communities are lucky that they rarely all suffer disaster at the same time. And they're lucky that they can connect to each other. And so they can help, if they manage things properly, they can help each other out. And this is an idea expressed for the Neolithic by Halston O'Shea in terms of the idea of a friend in need, very small communities around the Aegean help each other out. And by Horden and Purcell on a much larger scale, on the Mediterranean scale. And a short summary of their argument produced in one of the volumes that followed the publication discussing its ideas is presented by Nicholas. And he writes that the Corrupting Sea is based, and this is you can all screenshot this because this is your one slide summary of a 600-page book. And so this is what the argument of the Corrupting Sea is, that the Mediterranean has a distinctive regime of risk. I've agreed with that, but I've characterized it in, I think, quite different ways than they have. Because they focus mostly on this issue of gluts and dearth, so periods where you suddenly produce more than you can eat and periods where you haven't got enough to eat. That they see the logic of agricultural production as being a response to that. They pick out the topographical fragmentation, that the Mediterranean doesn't suffer global disasters and global good years. And then the most original and perhaps the most bold of their contentions, that there is a regime of communications, which tend to get summed up in the word connectivity, which means it can exploit the fragmentation of the Mediterranean in order to ameliorate the ecological precarity, marginality of so many of Mediterranean environments. So here you have the key variable in assessing the socio-economic characteristic of any Mediterranean microregion is how connected it is. If you're connected, then you don't need to worry too much about the gluts and dearths. But if you're not connected, too bad. Over the last few years, several of us, I think, have begun to worry a little bit about that proposition, how feasible it is. I won't summarize the things I've written on it, but others have chipped in as well. But I want to make 4 points very quickly. First of all, the capacity to move people or food rapidly is very limited. Mediterranean shipping doesn't have the capacity to move large numbers of people. It has no large transporters, even the slave trade. And when you begin to calculate the mean size of vessels, the number of journeys they take, the fact that most vessels taking people are also taking other goods as well, it's very difficult to believe more than about 50 or 60,000 people a year made a long distance journey. There's a high level of local mobility, but a very low level of long distance mobility. This obviously makes a big difference to the idea that if your mine goes out of business, you just jump on a ship and relocate to a new mine shaft being opened up at the other end of the Mediterranean. It also means you can't uplift refugees from disasters, where we saw that at Misenum and Pompeii and Herculaneum. Now, it's not just there isn't much capacity, it's really inelastic. It's very difficult to ramp it up. You can't suddenly say, okay, this year we're not going to use the Alexandrian grain supporters for grain. We're going to use it to take people out of this poor desolated island and take the mainland where there's work for them to do. There's very little elasticity in the transport system. There's also poor flows of information. In a Mediterranean, which can take 60 days for a message to get from one end to the other, it's quite difficult for a Mediterranean island or a little bay somewhere in southern Italy to get the message out that their crops failed. It's difficult to get it out to where somebody's crop has succeeded, because for a start, they don't know where that year's glut is that is going to balance out this year's dearth. There's a few ways you can get around it. You could bring all your surpluses to, let us say, Portus, and then you could send all your empty grain vessels to Portus and hope you can sort it out there. But this is not as efficient as moving directly from areas of surplus to areas of dearth. Very occasionally we see it happening, but it always involves a capital city, grain from Thessaly to Rome. Grain from Rome to Egypt in Trajan's reign. And then there's also this seasonal interruption, which is something which I haven't written about already, but certainly we're working at the moment. One of the difficulties that you've got a dearth when the harvest is in. You might know you've lost other crops a bit early if there's hailstorms, but you definitively know you're short of food at the time of the harvest. And unfortunately, this is the worst time of the year to go out looking for fresh grain elsewhere. Of course, other people are bringing their harvest there, but you're hitting that period of the Mediterranean where sailing is most dangerous. So you really need to overwinter before you get the other stuff in. So I think this model of connectivity dealing with fragmentation is one that we should be quite skeptical of. It doesn't mean it didn't happen, it just means the scale on which it could have happened is greatly reduced. Right, so much for response to disaster. How do you prepare for it? Oh, I'm sorry, I should say that I'm seeing a couple of points raising in the Q&A, but while I'm lecturing, I can't actually read the questions. So if there's anything very vital, like speak up, please, Greg, you're mumbling, somebody else needs to relay that to me.
Actually, if you mention that, I would also say, could everybody put their questions in the Q&A? I should have mentioned that at the start, but 2 people have. Anyway, back to you, Greg.
Thanks. Okay, how do you protect yourself against this? Well, the obvious way you protect yourself against aridity is you lay the water in. And the best example of this is the heroic efforts made particularly in the 4th, 5th and 6th centuries to increase the capacity of Constantinople to bring in water all the way from Thrace through enormously long and complex aqueduct systems, and then to store it in a series of enormous basilicas underneath the old city, as well as in reservoirs between the walls. And the recent work, relatively recent work done on the aqueducts of Constantinople, has demonstrated how amazingly well this was done. And of course, something similar is done in Rome from the 2nd century BCE, where we see more and more water being brought in. But you know, the peninsula of Constantinople, which doesn't have a river running through it in the way the Tiber does, this is even more vital. So cistern building, whether cisterns designed to catch rainwater, like in all those Spanish cities, or cisterns designed to store water aqueducts, this is absolutely essential. And it's, of course, a subset of the key answer to all of this, which is store. It's not connectivity that saves you in disaster, it's having money in the bank. By money, I mean water and food. Here, other places you store around the Mediterranean. There are a series of storage facilities that have been found. There's of course, enormous ones at Ostia, and some of these are grain stores which are designed to deal with the seasonal problems that food arrives before you want to put it in a vessel, or food arrives and you don't want to release it immediately because you'll depress prices. So some of it is a sort of valve in the system. But another function of granaries is to protect you against disaster. Occasionally the functions overlap. Again, early in Tiberius's reign, there's an anecdote about the Imperial Prince Germanicus visiting Egypt, who encounters one of the periodic food crises riots in Alexandria of the kind that are typical in all big cities of the ancient Mediterranean. And as Gandhi, I think, convincingly says, they're mostly triggered by price rises, not by actual hunger. He's got a nice anecdote he pulls, I think, out of Suetonius of Claudius facing a riot where they're so furious about the cost of bread, they pelt him with stale crusts. And as Gandhi points out, a rather dry way, if you're really starving, you don't throw bread at people, you eat it. And so these crises, price crises, are around. But Germanicus in Alexandria, he responds much to Tiberius's disgust by opening up the imperial granaries. Now, what the imperial granaries are doing is they're storing grain that has been cultivated along the Nile and brought down the Nile. And it accumulates in Alexandria, is stored there until it's the right time of year to load up those vast grain vessels, which can only dock in deep water ports, and so they can't shelter from storms anywhere else. So they really have to only go in good weather. And so it's all being stored there, ready to go to Rome. And Germanicus, in a sort of fit of goodwill to the locals, releases this into the Alexandrian market. So we know that these storage facilities exist all the way around the Mediterranean. Only rarely do we find them in provincial cities like Arles, but when we do, they're quite impressive. The capitals, of course, have much more impressive storage. And here is one of the products of the amazing Portus project, which much missed Simon Kay was the godfather of. Facilities here, as he and his team showed, constructing not just harbours and harbours that protect you from the winds, also a set of canalizations, connections, management of the Tiber, but also a whole series of storage facilities all the way from this point there, right the way up into the city of Rome, even north of the Tiber port, an immensely complex system. For those who haven't seen it yet, Astrid van Ooyen's book on the socioeconomics of Roman storage is an amazing anthropologically informed study of how storage works at every scale of Roman society, from farms up to these capital cities. Around the Mediterranean, deep water harbours are built where they can be. There's the Portus harbour again, but Caesarea Maritime is another good example of this. Vessel enabled by advances in technology, but also designed for the very large vessels that you can't just drag up on the beach as you can most 5th and 4th century vessels if things get tough. And also river ports. This nice model on the left reconstructs the very significant river port that was constructed in the Spanish port at Zaragoza, which is a long way up the Ebro, near the limits of its navigability, but shows the importance of riverine supply to this city. And also the willingness to build monumental port structures here. Monumental port structures found in Pisa as well. And also, it's not a brilliant picture, I apologize, but the monumental port at Aquileia along the river. And so these are also, like the much larger structures at Portus, signs that if you want to prevent disaster, the big thing to invest in is infrastructure. So you can bring in stuff, but this isn't bringing in emergency supply. This is bringing it in advance. So storage facilities, distribution facilities like the Porticus Minucia and so on. Building structures, not terrifically well explored, but it's very clear that some already by the 1st century CE, people have worked out ways of building that make you a little bit earthquake proof. So here you have the Pliny on what's going on in Naples. Remember perhaps Seneca's comment from not very much later about how public buildings seem to be more resilient in the earthquake of AD 62 than private ones, presumably partly because of these art superstructures. often speculated Vesuvian cities don't build up in the way Rome builds up, again, as a means of dealing with earthquake. And it doesn't seem to me at all unreasonable to imagine there's a lot of practical knowledge that hasn't found its way into Vitruvius and Pliny and Seneca and others about how to build in different areas to cope with local risk. After we think about the tradition of Japanese building, which is entirely based on mitigating risk, structures that are built to vibrate, and this true right from medieval Japan. There are also, of course, the imperial preventative measures. There's the Annona. We quite don't completely know what the Prefectus Annona does, but we do know that he operates a large fund and granaries and relationships with naviculari around the Western Mediterranean, presumably the Eastern Mediterranean as well. And also that this is something that emperors are proud of. Here is Severus Alexandria, a nice portrayal of Annona. She's waving whatever over a modius, a grain measure, and there's an anchor as well below there. So this is the whole thing together, measures of grain, connections to the ports, providing grain for the imperial city. And at the level of the cities, what do cities do? Well, we have this clause from the Lex Urnitan, the Flavian law in Spain, forbidding people to buy up and hoard stuff. It doesn't specify food, but it's quite unlikely that people are hoarding bronze statuettes or silk cloth. This is almost certainly a response, the same kind of response that we get in the rhetoric at more or less the same time at the other end of the Mediterranean from Diochrysostom, attacking grain speculators. And then the other major source of support cities have got is the work of benefactors. Benefactors could, of course, shell out money at time of when grain is short, but if the grain isn't there, this doesn't help very much. And so what benefactors are encouraged to do is to pay for grain funds. It's to give some cities the wherewithal to operate a kind of mini Annona system of their own. But most cities don't have big benefactors like that. The micro cities I'm talking about, very few of them have access to really wealthy people. So again, you're seeing a level of prevention that is quite limited. It's happening in imperial capitals and then the next tier down. What I've been arguing so far is that the remedies for disaster in the ancient world are very limited, that the empire itself helps few people or few cities, and it helps them in a way that is financially helpful in the long run, but it doesn't operate immediate disaster relief. Only a few cities, I've just said, are able to supplement that with local grain funds, local granaries, and so on. Of course, they're overrepresented in the epigraphy because our epigraphy represents particularly those large cities which have great benefactors to celebrate. So we're left then with the problem I started out with, which is given the ecological risks posed against urbanism, how does the urban culture of the ancient Mediterranean survive? It's not being propped up by the centre, only bits of it are being propped up by local grandees. What is it that makes ancient cities sustainable? Now, I think to start, of course, we need to very quickly look at what the Roman urban system looks like. And since I've actually lectured on this in the British school a few years ago, I'm not going to repeat myself enormously, but I do want to quickly resume what's the urban system look like. And the key variables, I think, is how many cities are there, how big are they? I've already said, so no surprise, they're pretty small, and where are they based? And then the key thing is, how does that fit with the Mediterranean risk regime? And so I'm basing myself on two projects, one led by Wilson of Arabia, by Andrew Wilson at Oxford, the Roman Economy Project work with Alan Bowman, and not only their collective works, but also Hanson's enormous study of the urban geography of the Roman world, which came out just a few years ago. And then another project run by Luc de Ligt in Leiden with a team of people. And the publications are only just coming out for that. But I've spoken to Luc and to John Bintliff, and I've got some general idea about where they're going. And broadly speaking, both these projects are revealing that there are several thousand cities in the Roman Empire, that most of them are really small. They differ a little bit in how many there are. That's partly because the threshold of a really small city and a large village or a town is quite difficult to tell the difference. And so the Leiden group bring in more. They're looking at maybe sort of 3,000 or so, at least at some points. Wilson, his collaborator, looking at less than 2,000. But this is actually more an apparent difference than a real one. They agreed there are very small, large numbers of cities, and the vast majority are tiny. This is Hanson's map of all the cities in the Roman world, which gives you some idea about where they're located, which is, I guess, everywhere, but particularly in the Mediterranean. But the key, I think, from my point of view, I might pop back to this slide in a minute, is the size. Most of these cities have populations of less than 5,000 people. Now, I'm giving this talk to you not from the great metropolis at the centre of the Mediterranean, but from the ancient burh of Crail in Fife, about 50 miles north of Edinburgh. It's a small Scottish village. It has only 2 pubs. It's that small. It has a bank. It used to have a post office. But it has about 3,500 people. So it's about average size for a city in the Roman Empire. This is what ancient cities were like then. Most of them, so this is at least 80% are in this category. And only a tiny number, maybe a dozen, maybe 10 have populations of 100,000 or greater at any point in antiquity, not all at the same time. So we're looking at the steepest of steep primate curves. You have capitals at the top, Rome maybe making it to 1 million under Augustus, Constantinople under Justinian maybe make it to 500,000. Most of the time they're in the high 100,000s. Otherwise, Antioch, Carthage, Alexandria, 100,000s, a few others. There's a significant scatter of cities in the sort of tens of thousands. They're highly concentrated in one bit of the empire. Egypt has, partly because of the caging effect of the Nile, has a denser level of urbanization than anywhere else. There are very few cities apart from Carthage and Rome in the Western Mediterranean that are more than sort of 30,000. Virtually none of the cities north of the Alps come into this category. They're actually all micro cities. The big cities, most of them were imperial capitals or are sustained by imperial privilege like Ephesus and Athens. So this is what the ancient urban system looks like. And the locations of these cities in the Roman Empire, they're all mostly on the sites of ancient cities. But of course, one of the things that's happened in this period is that big cities have become small and small cities have become big. And this carries on through to late antiquity. Rome shrinks, Constantinople grows, Alexandria shrinks, and so on. So that map that only puts dots on the map, that presents a certain image of sustainability, but the network itself, its resilience is partly dependent on the capacity to reallocate functions, military, imperial. There was this brief period in the 4th century where tetrarchic capitals suddenly throw up a bunch of cities with maybe a few tens, maybe nearly 100,000 each of them, cities that immediately shrink away again when the tetrarchic courts move on. So within that pattern, there are constant fluctuations, but the locations remain much the same. How about the responses to risk? So does this distribution represent a response to risk? Now, this is the kind of argument that ancient historians in particular are very liable to. You look at a system and you say, oh, it's evolved that way to sort of to deal with the ecological structures, that there's a kind of Panglossian idea, the idea that somehow we're all happily adapting and there's a homeostasis here, that any city that gets too big suffers a Walter Scheidel type style of disaster, of a Malthusian kind, and knocks them back down to size again. And this is both attractive and implausible, I think. It's attractive because just as those anthropologists who still idealize early agricultural societies and imagine that they're in perfect harmony with nature until Europeans arrive, or those anthropologists try to idealize hunter-gatherer societies to imagine they're having no impact on their environment until the wicked agriculturalists arrive, and I'm afraid James C. Scott falls a bit into that category. These are happy stories that are quite implausible now. In fact, in the late Pleistocene, hunter-gatherers are devastating the mega fauna and changing the vegetal environment enormously, as just agriculturists are. And so we shouldn't, I think, imagine that the ancient world has found a perfect balance. And the good tests of this, which you're not going to solve, I'm going to leave it with, is, did ancients know that large cities were dangerous? And I've looked pretty hard for anybody saying, this city is getting a bit big, we should watch it. And well, you can see there's clearly a discourse about getting people out of the city of Rome as it grows. But as far as I can see, it's never people saying, well, this number of people is causing strains on the urban infrastructure and causing difficulties in supply. And if they keep growing, they have to build another harbour. I can't find texts that say that. And I think Jules' analysis is much better, that they just really regard the poor as pretty unpleasant individuals. And the more they can get rid of them, that the language used of the poor it's closely associated with the language of dirt and pollution, and that the well-off, the healthy plebs, the property classes are quite happy to get rid of members of the Capiticensi. Just like the hoplite class in Athens really wouldn't mind too much if some of the impoverished Athenians pushed off. So I don't see any sign of a rational anxiety about civic growth. Were the cities in the more agriculturally precarious areas smaller than the safer environment? This is quite a good one to test. Is it true that in those areas I picked out at the beginning of the lecture, particularly worrying areas of high aridity and high interannual variability, are these areas that have small or a big earthquake? Are these where you have fewer cities? Well, no, actually not. Athens is the biggest city in the Aegean world, and it's in one of the most ecologically precarious areas. One of the most urbanized areas of central Italy is Campania, one of the worst areas for tectonic shocks. I could go on, but there's no real, where are the cities smallest? They're smallest north of the Alps, which suffers absolutely no aridity problems. And as we know from medieval and early modern growth, the carrying capacity of those territories is enormous. And Max Weber long ago pointed out that the transition from antiquity to the Middle Ages is largely to do with the exploitation of the agricultural potential of temperate Europe, and people realize, or an overtaking of the risky areas in southern Europe. So no, cities aren't in the right places. Let's approach instead through urban resilience. The idea here is the idea I've already alluded to, that cities are resilient to the extent they can evolve and adapt. Now, I'm not suggesting that ancient cities were able to rapidly shift from being tourist centres to educational centres. There's a few cities change function enormously at points where they become military centres or they lose their empires and things. But I think you can see this adaptability above and below the level of the city. You can see it in the network as a whole, functions being redistributed among the urban network. And I think you can also see it in the populations of these micro-cities. So one of the things about micro-cities is that they're able to use the same kind of adaptable strategies that we've known about for a long time with peasant societies. They can store much more. A city of 50,000 can never store another year's food. A city of 5,000, much more able to store in the way that peasant agriculturists can. There's no big surprise here, because a lot of the population of micro-cities are indeed agriculturalists, part-time or full-time. They're growing food inside the city, yes, even in Pompeii, and they're growing food around the city in the suburban areas. So the same kind of adaptable strategies that peasants adopt faced with ecological stress, eating stuff they don't really like, eating stuff they'd otherwise give to animals, storing ridiculous amounts of their harvest just in case. These are options available to the inhabitants of really small cities as well. Also, the question of dispersal. I don't mean suddenly offing from Crete to Catalonia, if that's the shift of balance. I don't mean that kind of long distance dispersal. That's only possible in the modern world with steamers or with people able to transport huge numbers of people and then put them into indenture or make sure they're your slaves so you can get the payback later. We no evidence of this happening in the ancient world at all. So dispersal means going off and living in the villages, living up on the hills. Indeed, something that's been done in some parts of Greece in the aftermath of the immediate economic crisis there. So dispersal, again, feasible for small villages, for micro cities, not feasible for the city of Rome. I'm sure the population of the city of Rome does vary through the year, and it probably does empty in the winter where there's less work to go around. But you certainly can't move most of the idle mouths out. If we're looking at stability, at urban resilience, what we're looking at then is particularly looking at this idea of resilience in sense of an ability to move things around, to fluctuate, a system that can shift its emphasis, can shift its population a little bit, that people do more than one job, that people have more than one kind of crop, that the system can, the roads can serve different functions. And this is all much more true of this vast hinterland of small cities than it is of the big ones. I'll move on quickly. Now, I said that where cities are located can help. So it's reasonable, I suppose, for me to offer some idea about why cities end up where they are. Now, if you look at it the wrong way around, from a medieval version of a late Roman map, it all looks beautifully organized, like on the Putinga table. Here is Rome at the center with the emperor holding the globe. And there is Portus down below and connecting happily to the rest of the empire, the Apennines in the background. Reality is a bit different. We're back, in other words, to this issue about adaptable cities. Sorry. The history of the development of the Roman Mediterranean urban system, which I'll give you on a single slide, I promise no more than this, is of the seeding of the Mediterranean with cities from nearly the beginning of the first millennium BC. The most important bit of this slide are the bits I put in bold, that the efforts of city building throughout let's call it the Archaic period, 8th through 7th centuries BC, where many, many new settlements are created and many of them fail. We can hear stories about their failure through traces of colonial myths and through many of the stories in Herodotus, in fact, but also included via Ephorus and others in Strabo, attempts to build cities, colonies that go wrong, colonies that merge, people are driven off by the natives and so on. We can also see it through archaeology. The great centres of the 8th century, like Pithecusae, are no more a few generations later. But by the 5th century, and also you can see it in the Euxine, the Black Sea area, where there are many, many more foundations attested than cities actually popped up. Yeah, maybe 100-odd foundations attested, about 20 cities by the 5th century. So this is an age of experimentation, and most experiments fail. Not enough to put people off creating new settlements, because presumably people from failed settlements move to new ones. This, in other words, is a period of massive trial and error. And these settlers are no better than James C. Scott's 20th century dictatorships in planning how to redistribute population. Instead, they're trying it everywhere, and wherever it fails, they move off and try it somewhere else. By the 5th century, the world has become more or less filled up. In a sense, the best spots have been taken. I remember Colin McEvedy showed this brilliantly in his atlas written in the 70s, that if you look around for sites that have the right kind of a landscape for a city, they've all got cities by the 5th century. Some of them think they're Phoenician, some think they're Greek, some think they're Etruscan, probably a lot of them are mixed origins, but they're more or less there and most of them survive. The next period of dramatic urban failures is the Roman colonial period from the 2nd century, or maybe the 3rd century BC onwards. Failed Cosa, failed Bruxentium, and so on. Again, they get refilled. Sometimes the Roman state just sends back colonists to places that have failed already. Seems crazy, but they do it. But eventually, enough of these cities survive. Now, what I'm suggesting, in other words, the story of this is that where cities ended up in the Mediterranean was the result of a long period of failures, but it ended up with most of the right spots being picked up. That not only is this shown in the differences between periods when things fail and when they don't, it's also shown by the propensity of destroyed cities to be refounded. So when a city in a perfectly good place does get destroyed, after a while, it gets put back, or something similar. So Thurii is put back more or less where Sybaris was. Carthage and Corinth absolutely destroyed. 100 years later, they're refounded. Our culturally orientated story talks about Roman guilt and anxieties about the past. But it's also perhaps true that Carthage just happens to be a really good place for a city, particularly if you're trying to get African grain out of Africa. And that this is presumably also the reason why Tunis ends up being put in a similar position. And at the bottom, a list of cities that are utterly destroyed in our historical sources and then pop back again merrily later. Thebes destroyed by Alexander, Marseille by Caesar, Jerusalem by, well, quite a lot of people, Byzantium, Severus, Rome many times, Antioch, I said, the 6th century, just a terrible whipping boy. How do these cities pop back? Well, one possibility is they weren't very well destroyed in the first place. I'm attracted here by Lynn Foxall's arguments about how difficult it is to actually destroy an olive grove using the kind of technology available in the ancient world. It takes ages to burn trees down. It takes even longer to cut them down. You might want to destroy the productive infrastructure, agricultural infrastructure of your enemies, but it's just not possible. And maybe cities too are just too difficult to destroy, and populations too numerous. You know, the destruction of Corinth. Well, we know there are people living in the area between 146 and the Caesarean foundation. We know that many of the monuments survive from one city to another, so it's not a complete sort of year zero. So maybe these cities are never totally destroyed. We know that stories about ploughing salt into the territory of Carthage are made up. The other possibility I've suggested is optimizing location, that the best locations will have cities appear in them, whatever you do to them. There's also a bit of what I've called network drag, that if you've got a network of cities interconnected by ports and roads and supply systems, that if you take any node out of that network, eventually it needs to be replaced. And, you know, and so perhaps the idea of an ancient world without a city somewhere near the Isthmus of Corinth, with a port into the Saronic Gulf and a port into the Corinthian Gulf, and city on the Isthmus. The idea of you not having a market and travel facilities there is just unimaginable. We could imagine maybe a slightly alternative universe where Megara takes over from Corinth, but there's always going to be something Corinth-like in that spot. And then finally, this idea that, you know, that the ancient world really didn't like destroying ancient cities. And I suspect that's been overplayed a bit, maybe shouldn't be completely neglected. So we have the destruction of Corinth, and then Corinth rises again and becomes an amazing city, and the biggest at the Roman West. And here is Seneca making the same point. So later on in the same letter, he turned, as he often does, from gloom to, in Lyon too, all its citizens will strive, everything should be rebuilt, better in size, secure than they've lost. May it be built to and endure under happier auspices for a long existence. It's only 100 years that the colony was founded, and so on and so forth. And I've given you the paragraph before, not because it's strictly necessary, but I just love this anecdote about Timagenes dragged from Alexandria to Rome, a curmudgeonly scholar forced to work for his Roman master, saying that the only reason he didn't like buildings burning in Rome was knowing they'd just be replaced on a better scale than ever before. So this gives us a sense about the regenerative capacity of ancient cities. Here to close with then is a picture of the Lyon that rises again out of the ashes of the Neronian fire and remained, of course, a major centre throughout the Middle Ages and indeed through the early modern period. These are some of the facts, I think, which have to fit into a sense of the sustainability or the recoverability or the regenerative powers of ancient cities in the ancient world. Thank you very much for your attention.